I'm tempted to wait till tomorrow on this story because I want to see if anything more comes out. But, if there's anything super substantial, I guess I could do a follow-up tomorrow. But for now, I want to discuss this breaking story because it's important to talk about it before we find out all the facts, because so many people are going to jump to the exact same conclusion. And so therefore, as someone who doesn't want to jump to that conclusion yet, who doesn't want to just jump to any conclusion, I think it's important that some of us who have a dissenting opinion speak out. And what I'm referring to here is this tanker in the Gulf of Oman, which, is Gulf of Oman technically is that body of water. It's hard to see. There's no fine line, I believe, but it's outside of the Straits of, it's before the Straits of Hormuz, before you get into the Persian Gulf, but it's not the Indian Ocean. Look at it that way. But so it's a big area where a lot of oil tankers pass through. Well, a technically Panamanian tanker, but really an Emirati tanker. It's owned by a company based in the United Arab Emirates. Was detained / hijacked, depending on who you ask, supposedly by Iran or Iranian proxies. That's what we're being told. Now, is there any evidence? No, we've seen no evidence. Why are we supposed to believe that this is Iran's doing? Well, it's because Iran, very bad government, they're terrorists. As we all know, the #1 state sponsor of terror, we're told by the American media. Of course, not including the American or Saudi Arabian government, but details. Iran, if you carry the two, seasonally adjusted, is the #1 state sponsor of terror, supposedly. And so they're the top suspect. We're supposed to believe, just offhand with zero evidence, that, okay, well, there's this tanker that seems to have been hijacked in the Gulf of Oman. It's not Somali pirates. It's not anybody. It's Iran. And Iran, I guess, wants to steal other people's oil because there's not enough oil in Iran. Right? And this is a part of a pattern of behavior, because we're told that Iran fired some shots, I guess, at an oil tanker last week. Again, this is what we're being told. Now, is there evidence of that? I don't know. I haven't seen any evidence that Iran was harassing any oil tankers last week. But we're told by Western media and by the Israeli government that that's true. And the new Israeli prime minister, who is eager to prove that he's more hawkish than Netanyahu, or at least as hawkish as Netanyahu, since this is the anti-Netanyahu coalition, they don't want to look weak, because Netanyahu is the big tough guy. And so if they are at all seen as weak on foreign policy, Netanyahu can come out and go, "Oh, this is why you need me back in power. These folks, they're too weak. They have Arabs in their coalition. They're being too soft on the Muslims." And so the new Israeli prime minister, I've already forgotten his name. He's in that power sharing agreement with Yair Lapid. In 2 years, I believe they're going to trade off, and Yair Lapid is going to be the new prime minister. But this current guy, I talked about him extensively when he first came to power not too long ago. It's just his name was something that I had trouble remembering. It's a weird name for me. He's come out and he said, "Hey, we've got the evidence. We know that Iran did this and they're behind it. We're going to retaliate with or without the West. So the U.S., they can choose to join in attacking Iran with us, or we're going to do it alone." And I haven't seen this repeated other places, but there was a pretty decently reliable energy blog, I guess you'd call it, at Oil on Twitter, OIL. And all of a sudden now their actual name escapes me, but they're at Oil on Twitter. Briefly posted, and I don't want to repeat this too much because, again, they quickly took it down, that there was an exchange of fire between U.S., British, UAE, and Iranian warships, or at least one ship, in the Gulf, and they were shooting at each other, and that the British Ministry of Defense was advising people to avoid the area. Now, why would this, this is a verified Twitter account, this is an energy blog, these are serious, this isn't even an OSINT account. This isn't Endgame World War III. This isn't Intel Doge. This is not Intel crap. It's not any of those guys. This is an energy blog. And so why would they post something up like this? They wouldn't just make it up. And then they quickly took it down, which to me would seem to indicate that there was something going on, and then they said too much, and their source was like, hey, don't post that publicly. Please take that down, and then they did. So it seems like we're going back into another one of these cycles where we're supposed to have ramping up Iranian tensions. And if I recall correctly, there are still some ongoing talks, which haven't been going well, apparently, according to Antony Blinken, between the U.S. and Iran regarding the U.S. re-entering the Iran deal. Well, if there was any hope of that happening, which seemed pretty slim at this point, those hopes have been dashed. Just because there is any suspicion at all, just because people are throwing the accusation that Iran is out there, there are Iranian pirates sailing the high seas, searching for oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman and stealing them and sailing them back to Iran. And that's what we're seeing. Again, last I saw, somebody tracking the ship on radar. I believe it's radar is how these ships are tracked. Maybe it's satellite. Maybe that's how you find all the tankers and things. It's the same sort of software or websites like you have where you can look up where all the planes are flying in the sky and the call signs. They have the same thing for these big ships. And the ships seem to be moving towards Iran. Now, I guess so far the Iranians have been acting like, oh yeah, this is a terrible thing. We're going to help you guys get to the bottom of this. Nobody should be hijacking ships. But then there's also people saying that, oh, well, it was in Iranian waters, and Iran detained it because they sailed into their waters. Which, I don't really believe that story. So there's a lot we don't know here. But again, the reason I feel compelled to talk about this so early before we know a bunch of stuff is because there's so many people out there, almost everyone I see, is willing to jump to conclusions and say, okay, we already know what happened. Iran's a bunch of terrorists, and they're stealing oil tankers because Iran needs oil so bad. Which, of course, if you just think about that for a couple minutes, doesn't make any sense. Iran's an oil-rich country. They don't need to have pirates out sailing around the Gulf of Oman looking to hijack oil tankers. They gain nothing from it. What do they gain? Oh, what do they need to... They want the UAE to pay them a ransom? Is Iran that poor that they need to have pirates hijack boats so that the government can ransom them? I doubt that. Maybe people are trying to say that because, maybe people remember the Iranian hostage crisis, even though that was, over 40 years ago? But even then, the reason why the Iranian government, which is the current Iranian government, was holding all those Americans hostage was because they wanted America to hand over the Shah, I believe. And so in that case, they had a clear goal in mind. They had a reason for taking hostages. I don't think it's a good reason. I don't think hostages should ever be taken by anybody. But they had a goal then. What's the goal here by taking this ship hostage and hijacking it and sailing it back to Iran? What does Iran have to gain? And that's an honest and open question. If you've got any suggestions, leave them in the comments. I'm open to it. I'm not saying Iran didn't do this, or so-called my favorite is Iranian-backed forces. Now, what does that mean? It means any terrorist group that isn't directly employed by the CIA or the National Endowment for Democracy, Iranian-backed forces. Now, they said that about the Houthis for years, even long before the Houthis had any official relationship with Iran. Back when nobody could get anything to the Houthis, and the Houthis were just fighting on their own. It was like, oh, well, you're in spirit. You're on the same side as Iran because you're against Saudi Arabia. And by definition, if you oppose Saudi Arabia, well, then you're in bed with Iran. It doesn't matter if you are officially in bed with them or not, or if you have any communication with them, or if you're even friends with Iran. You're doing their bidding because anyone who any harm that's done to Saudi Arabia is just to the benefit of Iran. It's just like what they tried to pull. It's like red baiting or McCarthyism. Anyone who criticizes the U.S. government back during the Cold War they were a communist sympathizer. They were doing the work of the Soviet Union. did the same thing during World War II. Oh, you're just a Jap apologist, Jap lover. I think that was a term that people used to throw around a lot. And then, of course, the original one, Nazi sympathizer, which they threw at all the America First Committee folks. And so anyone who has even a cursory knowledge of history has seen this movie before. I mean, hell, remember the sinking of the Lusitania? I mean, there's much worse things than hijacking the hijacking of a oil tanker that has been faked by Western governments before in order to provoke a war. How do we know that instead of these being Iranian-backed forces who hijacked this oil tanker, what if they're CIA-backed forces who hijacked the oil tanker in order to derail any possibility of the U.S. re-entering the Iran deal? I mean, you might say, I have no evidence for that. That's true. I have just as much evidence for that as all of these other folks on Twitter, these very smart, learned people, have for suggesting that this is that Iran is behind this. I have just as much justification. I can say, oh well, in fact, at least I can come up with some kind of motive for the CIA. A motive is not evidence, but at least it's something. And so to be clear, I don't think that the CIA did this, but I don't know. I don't know who did this. Doesn't make any sense to me. What I've heard so far. Not enough information out there, yet people are jumping to conclusions. So I'm going to wait for more information on this. And when we do get some more information, if it is somehow confirmed that Iran is behind this, I'll come out and say that. I have no problem saying that. I don't think that that's impossible. I won't say oh, I was wrong, if it comes out and that's true, because I'm not wrong. In principle, I'm correct, and all I'm saying is, hey, we should follow facts. Oh, and another thing we should follow, logic. Because what is the logic behind Iran doing this? What are the facts? We have none on neither side. And the Benji Shapiros of the world, who always love to jump and blame Iran for everything, maybe they should think a little bit more about those facts and that logic that they claim to love so much. Ben Shapiro's the king of facts and logic, right? Yet not when it comes to Iran. And I'd say the same thing about people who just pathologically blame everything that happens in the world on Israel. If you have evidence that Israel is behind some specific action, well then you've got a good case to make. But if you don't and you just say, Israel's probably behind this, well why? Well, because Israel's bad. Oh, okay. Yeah, very convincing. And so you got the Prime Minister of Israel coming out and saying, oh, Iran's behind this. We know. Trust me. We have the evidence. Oh, you want to share some of that evidence with the public? No, don't need to do that. And we're going to share the evidence with our allies. And if our allies aren't convinced, we're going to go ahead and attack Iran anyway. Because we know that if Iran retaliates against us, everyone else in the world has to defend us, or else they're going to be responsible for the final solution 2.0. For a second Holocaust, and we're going to blame it all on them. So all we have to do is, if we ever want these other countries, if we ever get in over our heads, we the Israelis, and we end up actually provoking a real hot war with Iran, which is a really big country, we know that we'll be safe because we can just invoke the Holocaust, and the West will come in and save us. And the Gulf Arab countries know the same thing because they have basically no militaries. They can't defend themselves. They can't do anything. Israel's much more capable militarily than any of these Gulf monarchies, these tin pots. But they know, hey, as long as Israel's on my side, I know that if Israel gets attacked, the West will have to come in and defend them, and by extension, me. So, there's a lot of perks in the Middle East to being on Israel's side. There are absolutely no perks in the Middle East to being on the side of Iran. Iran is one of those last remaining truly independent countries that is in no way beholden to the United States. And because of that, they are international pariahs, just like Cuba. And again, I don't like Cuba. I think that the Communist Party in Cuba, bad folks. I wouldn't want to live under their government. I wouldn't want to live under the government of Iran either. But that doesn't mean that the West, and the United States in particular, and Israel, just blaming them for everything that happens in the world. Every time that there's a rainy day, god damn those Persians, that doesn't make that fair. So that's all I have to say on the topic of this hijacked or detained tanker. With that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.